are recorded and transcribed. The recordings and transcripts will be available about a month after the summit. All questions from the audience should be submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And moderators will try to cover as many questions as possible. I'm now going to introduce Dr. Hala Annabi. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Hala Annabi, who is an associate professor and chair of the Master Program of Information Management Program at the Information School at the University of Washington in Seattle. Her research focuses on creating and maintaining inclusive learning organizations. Dr. Annabi is the director of Access IT, a research group focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion interventions in the technology industry, aimed at retaining and advancing women, as well as recruiting, retaining, and advancing autistic technology professionals. Dr. Annabi closely worked with industry partners to build equity and inclusion in the technology industry. She recently published the Autism at Work Playbook, a resource for employers who are interested in developing autism hiring programs. Dr. Annabi received her PhD in Information Science and Technology from Syracuse University and her MBA from Lemoyne College. Dr. Annabi's keynote presentation is titled Organizational Factors Enabling the Scaling of Autism at Work Initiatives. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Annabi. Okay. Dr. Annabi? You're on mute.
There we go. Good morning, everyone. I couldn't unmute myself for a minute, so I apologize for the delay. I'm so happy to be here. I feel honored to be in the presence of everyone in this community and to be joining all our great panelists and presenters this morning and today. As Lawrence had mentioned, I am a faculty member at the University of Washington whose passion is helping organizations of all kind. Early in my career, I've been focusing significantly on the IT industry, but my goal and my passion is to help organizations create an environment where all people can apply their talents so that we can produce better products, better services, and a better environment. So over the years, I've focused on identifying barriers that exist in different types of organizations that inhibit people that have been historically underserved in these organizations to participate in the workforce. I do this work in the context of a research group that I've started and I direct called Access IT. It's a group that aims to build a context for creating employment success. And over the last 10 to 12 years, I focused on women and autistic people in particular. And my work with my collaborators focuses on issues of preparation. So I developed a preparation program at the University of Washington for autistic students interested in IT to help them prepare for the IT workplace. I also work with organizations to identify areas where there might be barriers or challenges in recruitment, onboarding, and retention and advancement of women and autistic professionals. I do this work in a team of interdisciplinary context. I have individuals who work in the medical school, speech and hearing, Microsoft research. I have a number of students and self-advocates also participate in this work to advance our understanding and to empower work more broadly. In earlier presentation, from Dr. Mayo, and thank you, Dr. Mayo. This was a great presentation this morning. We've heard a lot about why employment is so important in the context of all people and in the context of potentially individuals on the spectrum. We know that employment is core to a person's quality of life. It's not just a means for independent living, it's also a means for individuals to pursue their interests and improve their cognitive performance. It's about their ability to contribute to their societies and their communities and in their ways, in the variety of ways. It's also about meeting inclusion needs and a feeling of belonging when we work within the context of organizations and communities. Research tells us that employed disabled individuals experience higher quality of life, and especially when their employment opportunities are integrated employment. Early research shows us that employed autistic individuals experience financial benefits, but even more so, emotional and health benefits when they are employed in an inclusive environment. With this understanding, that's the focus that my work and today's presentation is on. And we are focusing on individuals on the autism spectrum to address the low unemployment that they've experienced over the years. We know that we do not have comprehensive data to tell us what is the employment rate of individuals on the autism spectrum, but early indications tell us that only about 14% of individuals on the spectrum are employed, compared to 19.3% of all disabled persons and 66% of individuals without disability. That disparity is what helps us focus on this work and motivates us to address some of these challenges, these unnecessary challenges. And what we've noticed over the last 5 years in particular, that there's been some improved opportunities for individuals on the spectrum. We see that there are specific industries, the IT industry, but also many industries, professional and labor industries, have turned their attention and are trying to meet their employee or talent needs. We also see that there are more and more government supports that are happening on an international level, on the US level, but also in different states and counties. We also see that there is significant focus in the academy and in technology industry on developing assistive technologies to help with employment, to facilitate employment. And we also see, from a societal perspective, a shift and a focus on abilities and co-abilities. We are moving away from a deficit model view of neurodiversity and disability to a focus on a strengths-based perspective and a co-ability, which is enabling us to focus on this work and really empower this work. Some of the latest work using strength perspective has outlined a variety of co-abilities, strengths, and unique talents that people on the from neurodiverse perspectives bring to the workplace and bring to society. We see a variety of studies and a variety of companies and organizations focusing to develop those talents. In terms of autism, highlighting that autistic people tend to be very committed, and the attention to detail can be really helpful in certain industries. ADHD, individuals with ADHD have creativity and have a hyper focus that is really helpful in creating original solutions. Dyslexia's enhanced visual and spatial system thinking can be really important and create innovation. So that focus and that shift on strengths perspective and what my work tries to encourage and promote in organizations is what we're seeing being more broadly understood and more broadly adopted, that is enabling what we think of as autism at work initiatives to emerge and to grow. So over the last few years, we've seen a number of companies across many industries create employment opportunities for individuals on the spectrum. Now, my presentation is going to focus on my work related to autism at work, but many of these lessons that we are going to highlight around how organizations can develop, grow, and hopefully scale autism at work initiatives can be transferable for people of different neurodiversity backgrounds and create employment programs that are more holistic and more inclusive as well. So I just want to highlight that, understanding that there's a diversity of individuals on the call today interested in different aspects of neurodiversity. But what we see, what started in 2004 by Specialist Sterna in terms of specific employment program focusing on autistic individuals, many of the lessons learned have been used by different companies, starting with SAP, Microsoft, EY, as well as Rising Tide, as well as John's Crazy Socks. So we see some of these lessons about how to create these programs and create them in a way that is sustainable, in a way that creates more employment opportunities, but not just any employment opportunities that focus on strength, build an inclusive, healthy, welcoming environment for the employees on the spectrum to be able to contribute their talent and to be welcome members of the community. So we see great potential in these programs, but we also see that there are questions and challenges as we grow the programs and as we develop, and some unanswered questions that we hope to get. So this is where my work started. I started looking at how organizations have been able to create these programs and wanted to identify what are the unique characteristics of the programs and the organization that enabled the creation of such programs and enabled their scaling across geographic areas, also their scaling across organizations. We know that SAP, EY, Microsoft, and others have helped many other organizations learn the lessons as well. So we want to understand what was unique about these organizations that enabled that transferability and that work to have a greater impact. So I started my work looking at some of these organizations, identifying these key organizational characteristics to figure out what are the best practices that we can carry forward. And as Lawrence mentioned, we developed in collaboration with EY, Microsoft, SAP, and JP Morgan Chase, we created the Autism at Work playbook to distill these lessons and best practices so other organizations can use it. And I'm going to talk specifically about some of our findings in the playbook and frame them in the context of the key characteristics, in the context of why did these organizations create such programs? What was it about their reason? What was it about their context that enabled the creation and the growth? How did they do it? What are the characteristics in relation to their methods and practices that enabled that scaling? And then what was their impact? What is it about these programs and what they produce that enabled that scaling? So I'm going to try to summarize what we've learned in the hope that we can gain better understanding of these programs, and for many of the folks on the call today who are interested in creating and growing their programs to take some of these lessons, hopefully. So we'll begin with the why. The first thing we learned very quickly is that the organizations that created these wonderful Autism at Work programs, just like Stanford and their neurodiversity initiative, they were very mission driven. Even before they began their Autism at Work programs, their programs had a focus and a commitment on inclusion and on access. They had executive commitment, and that executive commitment came publicly. They also had not just executive commitment, they had champions that were able to execute. They identified thought leaders and company leaders who had the influence to create these programs and support these programs. Lastly, in terms of commitment, that commitment surfaced in terms of dedicated resources over time. Commitment in verbal context was not sufficient before some dedicated resources. So these three characteristics around organizational commitment is the first organizational characteristic and factor that enabled that work. And I'll give you an example that is very public. Microsoft commitment, for example, to accessibility in terms of accessibility to their technologies and creating accessible technologies for their customers was already infused in the organization. There is a value on diversity and inclusion and human potential that's embedded in that organizational culture that enabled a very clear commitment on the executive level, the different individuals on different levels of the leadership to commit to seeing that work go through, and over time dedicated resources. And you see that in a lot of the public communication about autism at work programs that we studied across these programs. And it's very similar across the other cases that we've seen in SAP and EY and JP Morgan Chase that was already embedded in, of course, Stanford and Lars's commitment to accessibility and inclusion. That's also permeates Stanford and what we see happening in that program as well. The second thing that was really important from an organizational characteristic of what made these programs scalable, they were mission driven and they aligned autism at work initiatives with their strategic goals. There was a commitment to access and inclusion, but also it was embedded in their strategic goals. They identified the value proposition for these programs in terms of meeting talents for their organization. So again, this emphasized the strengths perspective of autism and enabling those talents and valuing and celebrating those talents, which moves us to the strength-based model that we so emphasize and find it so important, highlighting enhanced productivity, efficiency, innovation that people on the spectrum bring to the workplace, and the importance of reflecting the diversity, the neurodiversity of customers in society, and being able to say, we are going to commit to reflecting our society and our community. SAP publicly a number of years ago made a commitment to reflect their customer base and their society by saying, we are going to have 1% of our employee base be on the spectrum because that's just a reflection and representation of society. That's another way to align autism at work programs with strategy and with overall strategy beyond just inclusion. The other dimension and characteristic, which is critical in the context of autism at work programs, is employee-centric culture. Many of these firms that you see on the Autism at Work Roundtable Disability In website, if you look closely at these companies and how these companies have been described over the years and how their employees talk about these companies, they are companies that have an employee-centric culture. They are a company that celebrates human potential. They allow creativity, innovation. They are open to changing processes in order to engage employees. They have a strong sense of community internally and within their society as well. And they have very clear communication around these values and enable communication across different constituents within their organization to enable that employee-centric culture. And you see that across many companies. For example, if you talk to folks at EY who are involved in autism at work or not, they talk quite a bit about how EY is always one of the top companies to work for because of their employee-centric culture, because they are a good place to work, because they have all of these supports. So all of these characteristics create the environment that is healthy to cultivate an inclusive autism-ready workplace that has a strength view of talent and have the ability to learn to foster differences and celebrate differences. So that's the first set of organizational characteristics that we've seen that enable autism at work programs to be created and to be sustained. Now, there's a lot of important nuances about how do you create the programs. Programs look very different. One of the things that we've learned very quickly looking at these programs, and you see it in the Autism at Work playbook, we emphasize that the design of these programs have to be unique to the context of the firm, the organization that's creating them, the community within which this organization is created, and the community of autistic employees that are joining this company. So they designed a program that works, and that works in the context of their company and their employees. So they design an employment model that meets the firm's needs in terms of culture, in terms of business model, in terms of resources. They align it to the organizational values. They do not create a program that is separate from the organization. And they address the firm's talent needs, and they're very specific to emphasize the strength model. And you're going to hear me talk about having a strength perspective. And I know Lawrence has highlighted that earlier. But that's a critical piece that we see in all of these programs. The second aspect of designing a program that works for that specific organization, and I want to highlight that even within an autism at work program, you might see some differences depending on the type of employment, depending on the departments, depending on the geography. All of that to say is that it has to be centralized and aligned with the context of the work and the business. The other characteristic that we also identified is the fact that they leverage existing organizational resources. Many of these organizations of different size across different industries have leveraged and empowered self-advocates that are in their organizations to help guide and provide feedback for these programs. In some cases, and SAP talks about this, and JP Morgan Chase talks about this as well in some of their presentations, self-advocates are delivering training as the program is maturing. They're taking on some of the training components, leading certain aspects of the program. That empowerment is, again, a commitment to the value of inclusion and strength-based perspective. They draw on the talents of the HR, legal, DEI, and ERGs that already exist in their organizations. So understanding that there's much to draw from, that they're not starting from scratch necessarily, and understanding how to create the partnerships across these different internal units is critical. And draws on employees' expertise and passion overall in terms of recruitment, in terms of mentoring and support. So again, it's a holistic community, employee-based initiative that doesn't just reside within the executives that are committed or within the champions and employees that are committed to the program. It requires commitment and drawing on peers, employees within the teams and across the organization more broadly. The next characteristic is developing an inclusive environment and really working explicitly on educating employees on neurodiversity and empowering and educating supervisors with strategies about how to communicate effectively. And this is really important because it moves the onus of change and collaboration, not just on the person on the spectrum, but also on their teammates and on their supervisors to learn different methods and strategies. One of the critical things we find in the research, and you'll hear many firms talk about it, is the fact that many colleagues, collaborators, as well as supervisors who engage in these educational opportunities around raising awareness of neurodiversity become better collaborators and better managers across the board for people on the spectrum, other neurodiversities, and neurotypicals. So we call this the spillover effect. Many of the strategies that managers are learning to communicate effectively or lead or support an autistic person are actually key lessons of management that apply across many different people and are really important. So in some ways, we see some of these programs becoming catalysts for positive change for the entire organization. And that's incredibly important going forward for the scaling of these programs. Other aspects of designing a program that works is thinking about Autism at Work initiatives as supporting not just preparing for the interviews or changing the recruitment mechanisms or even the onboarding. It's understanding that these programs have to support autistic individuals across the life cycle of employment. And the programs that are learning how to scale, and many are doing this incredibly well, they continue to learn, new things arise as well. They understand how to change their recruitment processes to focus on the relevant talents to work and how to create the right support structures to surface that talent. Lawrence, in his example of Stanford's model of how they prepare folks, is one example of that. Partnering with hiring teams that the individuals will be placed in is a critical part of creating an important recruiting mechanism. Also thinking about the process as iterative, as things always change and individual differences are clear, so there is no one size fits all, and being iterative to understand those diversity of needs and providing accommodations that will change over time is critical. And that's one of the things that the most successful programs are working towards and are doing, and we're seeing examples of great success throughout these programs. And this is what we call the adopting a holistic approach to employee support. You saw a similar slide to this from Lawrence earlier on, is thinking about how to support the individual that is being hired, both internally to the company as assigning them mentors. These mentors often come from their teams as buddies, or they come from outside of the teams, often from ERGs, but also ERGs that are based on interest. So individuals can have a social community with other employees outside of their teams. We see this a lot. We see these examples. Microsoft talks about, for example, some of the employees leveraging different interest groups within their broader community. The team being trained, being supportive, the manager having the right tools and being supported. You see these internal as well as external support cycles or circles that are critical to think about the employee as a person, of a support structure outside of work as well as support structure inside of work, and being more intentional and explicit about how to leverage these supports, and using the job coaches that are often community-based to facilitate that integration between the internal and external is a critical component. And I'm sure you're going to hear a lot about these support circles in the next few days. One critical part that also Lawrence alluded to earlier on in terms of the Stanford model is understanding the ecosystem. These firms and these organizations don't do autism at work programs that are scalable and effective without understanding of their ecosystem. I mentioned earlier that one of the key characteristics is they learn how to leverage their internal resources, but also they know how to build relationships and leverage the local community, like autism employment specialists that exist in their communities, DVR resources and coaches, education institutions that help with preparation, partnerships with universities, high schools, vocational programs are critical to the creation, but also the scalability, especially in terms of identifying talents and creating the bridges between individuals and these employment opportunities, and broader communities. Again, when you think about the external cycle and the talent pool, the community is a key part of that. And another part of the ecosystem is also understanding the state, national, and even international context of DVR policies, funding agencies, creating all the supports and sharing of the lessons. I think the employer roundtable is a great example of how there's an ecosystem across companies from different industry sectors that come together to share best practices, to brainstorm, to pool resources and initiatives to benefit the community. This is a great example of an ecosystem that is really moving not just employment programs at a local level in an organization, but employment programs on a national level, and creating a movement to really adopt and strengthen a strength-based perspective. And that integration and exchange within the ecosystem is what allows that scalability of these programs in a meaningful way. And that's critical. One important dimension of understanding how these ecosystems become important and enable these programs to grow is making sure that the ecosystem values and the organizational values and needs are aligned. There's an important element that when we talk about creating programs that work for the organization and use a strength-based perspective, there's also an understanding that not every model that exists in an external community might fit a particular organization and vice versa. So how we calibrate these values, how we calibrate these practices was a lesson I heard over and over talking to different firms that engage or are about to engage in these autism hiring programs and growing autism hiring programs. So understanding that dimension, understanding whether there are the right supports is really important. And this is a critical component of both assessing the readiness of the ecosystem, but also how you invest in the ecosystem so that you can get that calibration of internal and external as well. Another dimension of autism hiring programs that is effective and efficient in the context of our work and a strength-based perspective is understanding the impact of these programs. Why are we doing these programs, and how do we know whether we're doing it well and we're having the desired impact is critical. So establishing assessment and feedback mechanisms is really important. We see a lot of these programs having feedback mechanisms where they ask the individuals who participated in the interview and recruitment processes about what worked and what didn't work for them, and then feed that back into their iterative ways of conducting these programs. So having the voice of the self-advocates coming through that feedback and assessment is really important. Understanding from the managers and colleagues' perspective whether the supports the firms and the training provided them was sufficient and what else is needed is really critical. And understanding that any systemic assessments or feedback mechanisms have to align with the firm practices across the board and are enabling the firm to celebrate the successes and identify areas for improvement are really critical. And understanding how to measure and how to balance the social impacts of these programs and the importance of improved performance within the teams and across these hiring initiatives is really critical as well. So understanding the values and cultures and type of organizational model and what is important to measure and how to measure it and how to communicate about it is also a critical organizational factor that is complex but is important to be aware of. Understanding the implications for team dynamics and the employee well-being overall is really critical as well. And this is something that we see in the teams, and we see a lot of questions in the different organizations that we are working with and continue to provide supports with. And lastly, in terms of understanding the impact of these programs is really telling the stories, being able to celebrate the successes, being able to speak openly about the things that are continuing to work and improve is really important. You see many of the firms that are scaling their programs and creating initiatives are talking about their stories locally. In their organizations, you see the champions talk about the successes and the stories. You see the self-advocates talking and promoting these stories. You also see some of these stories being communicated on a societal level. A couple of weeks ago, CBS ran a story where they highlighted EY and Vanderbilt's initiatives and other initiatives to show the dynamics and the stories, and that changes and strength, or more like reinforces the strength perspective of autism employment programs societally, not just locally. And those are really impactful methods that many of the companies that have been able to scale have showed and surfaced. And being intentional about it, not just doing it once or twice or at the beginning, but continuing to reinforce these messages becomes more and more important as we scale, both on a local level and in a national level as well. So those are the core characteristics that we saw. But we also know that these programs at the scale that they're in, we're still learning, and we still develop more and more as time goes on. And every year I go to the Autism at Work summits, I hear more and more nuances about how these programs are being designed and delivered. And here are some of the key questions that we see highlighted that continue to require some of our attention. How do we sustain and scale these programs across different geographic regions? in the US, outside of the US, in small companies and big companies. Those are some of the things that we hear over and over again. How do we better serve individuals across the spectrum? Some of the programs I talked about focus on a lot of IT talent and professional talent. What about other types of talent? How do we surface them, and how do we learn from other programs, not just the big firm programs? Are questions that we continuously get, and we try to get those lessons to address. Questions around how, employee support. How do we create strong and well-aligned ecosystems? How do you create those advocacy groups within the community to strengthen that ecosystem is really important. Employee support and advocacy. How do we best include the voice of self-advocates in the design and execution of these programs? And I used a couple of examples from SAP and others who are continuing to do that. How do we respect and protect the privacy of employees as they advance in the program and move from one team to the other are things that we're hearing. How do we address mental health needs in the workplace as they arise? How do we better prepare the workplace? How do we prepare supervisors even on a larger scale? Because we know that some individuals, neurodiverse individuals, might not self-disclose, and they are in companies. So how do we leverage what we learned in autism hiring programs and make them more mainstream across different components of the organization so that self-advocates can participate and lead in some of these initiatives as well? What are effective interventions and what kinds of programs are necessary to improve knowledge and attitudes of coworkers and managers beyond ones that are involved in autism at work initiatives? That's a critical question that continues to surface as well. The other piece that continues to surface is how do we prepare autistic individuals for the workplace from high school to college? How do we get life skills? How do we continue to develop and help individuals with positive self-image is some of the questions that I get asked from my students. Recruitment, there are a number of questions around how do we scale recruitment in numbers and types of jobs? How do we actually create the right communication between the community and the opportunities? Sometimes there's a disconnect between who knows about the positions that are open and how we connect talent with positions. And of course, across the spectrum, across gender, across identities is really important. Other questions around how do autistic people measure and talk about their own success? I actually saw earlier in the morning around 8:30 or 9, a question from one of the participants talking about how do evaluation metrics take place for autistic individuals that go through these programs. In my study, we find that it's employment and evaluation metrics are consistent across all employees. And one question is, well, how can autistic employees actually influence some of these measures and how they talk about their own success? How do we measure organizational impact in very different ways and have self-advocates have a voice in that are some of the questions that we also hear and see that we are investigating and working on. How do we create evaluation systems aligned with organizational values and culture and equitable for autistic employees? Those are some of the critical questions that we are investigating and looking into as well. So there's a lot of great work and great examples that we've identified. There's still a lot of work that continues to be done, and hopefully with everyone engaged, we continue to address them. For those who are interested in how to start an autism at work or a neurodiversity program, employment program, I highly encourage you to take a look at the Autism at Work playbook. In the Autism at Work playbook, we identified 5 questions, critical questions that can guide your exploration of creating such a program. First, being clear on why you want to create a neurodiversity program or an Autism at Work program. Thinking about how it aligns with your values, how it aligns with your strategy, and how you can create the right messaging around that. Who can help is a critical part. Who are the champions on the executive level? Who can carry the operational level work? what internal and external entities or resources exist that you can leverage is another question where that can guide your design. How do we make the business case for this in many organizations? What's the value proposition? And how do I create the right return on investment argument? Where do we start? What's the scope of the program? How big? Where should the pilot be? How do I find the right talent for that pilot? And lastly, how does success look like? What should I be aiming for? How do we iterate and grow the program are some of the things that you can think of. And the Autism at Work playbook provides a lot of examples and checklists and ways for you to engage in these questions so that you can hopefully join the Autism at Work Employer Roundtable in that initiative and leverage what already exists, which is a collection of employers that are passionate and committed in meaningful ways, both from a social impact perspective, but also from a deep understanding and commitment to looking at neurodiversity from a strength-based model, from a co-ability model that empowers employees, gives voice to self-advocates, and grows that talent in meaningful ways that aligns with values of inclusion and human development and potential. So I urge any employers out there that are listening to this to think about ways that we can help and engage you in these programs, and not to forget about the Autism at Work Employer Roundtable that has a lot of these talents. And this Autism at Work playbook is available there as well. So with that, I will conclude and want to thank the neurodiversity group in Stanford for inviting me to be part of the summit, and I'm open to questions.
Wonderful, thank you so much. As somebody who has read and used the Autism at Work playbook myself, it's such a wonderful resource, and this is has been such an amazing discussion of it, and there are many comments to that effect from the audience. So thank you so much for your presentation on it today. And actually, one of the first things I want to ask that came up several times is, where can people find the Autism at Work playbook?
So there are a couple of places to find it. You could type Access IT at iSchool. And actually I can even, I'll put it in the chat. I'll give you the direct link, but you could find it on my website, which is Access IT at Ohio, or at ischool.uw.edu. It's also, if you Google Autism at Work Employer Roundtable, that page has a link to it as well.
Okay, thank you. And we'll help you provide that link if need to be. It sounds like remembering that one is a difficult one, but it's such a wonderful resource. So if people can find access to it. So we had a few questions about people who were thinking about Autism at Work programs or neurodiversity at work programs. One was from somebody who said, we are a small company that wants to expand opportunities for neurodiverse individuals. The companies you mentioned are quite large and well-resourced. Do you have any advice for an organization that is more resource constrained?
Yes. So the emphasis on your ecosystem becomes really critical. Many of the smaller firms actually might not require as much investment in infrastructure, but they can leverage nonprofit and government agencies within the community to establish some of these programs. And the scale by which you want to design that program could actually be pretty readily available to you. So I think the first step I would say is look for the local resources in terms of DVR and other nonprofit organizations, like in Washington, Provale and the ARC provide a lot of resources to help with training, so you can leverage them with training. You could also leverage the Autism at Work Roundtable and the resources they provide to identify those steps. So that's a place where you can start and scale in that way. But your local resources are available to you, and agencies that are funded to help develop these programs could be a great place for small businesses to leverage those resources.
All right, thank you. And along that vein, we had another question asking about, do you work with nonprofits to scale Autism at Work initiatives?
So I personally currently have not worked with nonprofits, but I know some in the Autism at Work roundtable has communicated with nonprofits to work there, but I personally have not.
Okay, thank you. We had a couple questions from people who wanted to ask about needs of individuals, and one question focused on addressing mental health needs from somebody who has autism and OCD and has challenges with efficiency, and was interested in your approach on helping people on the spectrum to address deficits that are an obstacle to productivity.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think this is one, I do want to mention that one of the trends that we see in industry, that there is a significant focus over the last 3 years on mental health broadly in many organizations. So we're seeing organizations invest in programming and resources to assist individuals. I think the first step for an individual in an organization is to reach out to their HR and their employee support systems to identify different accommodations that might be available to them. Some of the things that we see being employed are flexible time, flexible ways to communicate. There are some assistive technology around productivity and flexibility that are also being utilized and developed. Also, job coaches are ones that can help with some of these specific accommodations. Many of these accommodations can be very individual based on the person's identity, resources, needs, the job that they do. So a collaboration between a job coach from the community or from their organization is critical to start that conversation and to identify the different tools. But I will say that one of the things we're seeing across many organizations is better attention and better support towards some of the issues that this individual surfaced.
Thank you. And we do have another question, and it might be a similar answer, but it's specific to IT companies. And what are some of the examples of accommodations for neurodiverse folks, and what might they self-advocate for in IT companies?
Yeah, and again, it always depends on the person's needs and the job and the team. But for example, one of the things that we see that is becoming standard for many neurodiverse individuals, lighting and sound are critical. So one of the things we're seeing in a lot of IT companies is it's becoming standard for everybody to have noise canceling headphones and explicitly state what kind of lighting environment that they could be in. There are also accommodations that I've seen. I do some interviews with self-advocates to talk about the accommodations that work best for them, is the placement of their office and their desk. The other accommodations that we've seen individuals ask for that have been really effective is how many days you can work from home and how many days you need to be in the office. Obviously now with the pandemic, everybody's working from home, but those are some accommodations to think about. So flexibility, certain technologies, there are certain tools for productivity and memorizing that are important to ask for. Some of the simple things that we also see in terms of accommodation and communicating with the manager is perhaps being explicit about the type of documented tasks that might help. So instead of in the meeting, having somebody take meeting minutes so that the person doesn't multitask is a critical one that we see being very effective. And being explicit, asking managers and colleagues to be explicit about what they are expecting and how they can help is really important. So those are some of the conversations. Again, I want to highlight that the job coach at the beginning is a wonderful facilitator of these conversations, and they have specific tools and that engage you in these conversations. So make sure you leverage them if you can.
Great, thank you. And along those same lines, when for individuals in the workforce, Now for somebody who may be less in an environment that is less accepting, we have a question about, do you have thoughts on how to address issues? For example, if someone on the spectrum who is being bullied at work, do you have recommendations for handling those situations?
Yeah, so I think if a person feels or is seeing that someone is being bullied or mistreated, I think it's important for everybody to recognize their place and what their sphere of influence, who they can actually leverage if they're not comfortable themselves talking to the person who is creating those behaviors. So you could talk to a colleague that might be someone that you trust, like a mentor. Your supervisor is someone that you could reach out to and address some of these behaviors with. And then you can also reach out to HR to help facilitate those conversations. Those are the three ways that one can start to address those behaviors in an environment that is less conducive.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. You had mentioned COVID-19 and our current environment. Can you talk about what challenges you believe organizations will have in addressing autism at work, either post-COVID or during COVID?
That's a great empirical question. So some of the things that are surfacing, and I hear it, so I did some interviews with autistic women in particular and their involvement in the workplace. And there's a balance of need of being in a social environment where they can feel like they're part of the team without having to explicitly engage. The fact that everybody's working virtually has created some barriers for that and it's creating feelings of isolation. So one of the challenges for some of these programs, and again, these are anecdotal, they're not empirical by any stretch of the imagination, is some companies and some teams are trying to figure out what is the balance of creating feelings of inclusion, especially for new hires. And how do you do that using technology? How do you do that using different ways of connecting? Is something that all companies across different types of programming are trying to address. The other aspect of addressing that some of the challenges that are surfacing with the pandemic is some of the insecurities around job safety and job security in certain industries. So being explicit about what is happening in the organization and communicating that and reassuring people around the stability of the company has become an important dimension, especially for the manager to be able to communicate explicitly. Because and we see, for example, since March, many people are losing their jobs, but we're seeing a higher number of individuals with disability using their jobs than people without disability, 1 to 5 versus 1 to 7. So those are some of the things that companies can do to reduce some of that anxiety. And I said a lot of different things. But I think part of what I'm trying to say is we're trying to figure some of these things out. There's focus on social versus task-oriented activities that managers are trying to figure out a balance for. And then there's the context of job security that is surfacing that we're also trying to address.
Yeah, thank you. It's complicated and ongoing, so there's a lot to figure out when it comes to our current situation. So you had talked about self-advocates during your talk and their involvement in the process, and there was a lot of people who were, expressed happiness about that and wanting to see more self-advocates involved. But we also had a question relating to how do you work with self-advocates in a way that ensures confidentiality, ensures that they are trained in such a way to understand safeguarding mental health risk or trauma or other things that might come up that they would not necessarily have a expertise in as they're working with people.
Absolutely. So this is a great question. I think I'll answer the first one in terms of privacy and self-advocacy. I think the critical part is each individual, the programs that I've seen have leveraged self-advocates. The self-advocates are open and had the choice to disclose and present and participate as a self-advocate more broadly in the firm. So you have the choice of how visible you want to be. So the choice has to be given to the self-advocates. The other piece of, how do you prepare the person to take on these roles, understanding the complexities around some of the leadership roles. It comes with training and mentoring. So many of the individuals that we're seeing leading those teams are individuals that have been part of the program, have been mentored to be parts of the programs, and bring those skills and talents. So I think it's an individual training and development piece, like you would do with a neurotypical as well. Many of these skills are learned skills, and working with individuals based on their interest, their ability to mentor and develop them into these roles is what's critical. And we do that for all employees, and we need to do that equitably to fit the person's needs, desires, and abilities.
Yeah, thank you. That's
You're
really
welcome.
helpful. And that actually, there's a related question, which is for managers and supervisors, where should they look to find trainings to educate and empower supervisors or managers?
Yeah, so many of the firms that have Autism at Work programs have training specific to teams and managers. Now, for firms or for individuals that don't necessarily have these types of programs, there are resources that are continuously being developed. There are resources that the Autism Advocacy Network has also put online. So there are some online resources. I know, for example, one of my collaborator and I in Microsoft Research, we just developed a communication module that is being published as well. So some of these things that are surfacing and being posted on the Autism Employer Roundtable or the different networks are places that managers and colleagues can leverage. But also there are, one of the things you will see in the last page of the Autism at Work playbook are we provided you with a number of agencies and resources where you can find some of that training if your firm doesn't provide it. I'm happy to, actually there is, Andrew Bagel and I did a training for managers and colleagues in the Autism at Work Summit 2 years ago that's available on YouTube that you could actually look into. I'm sure Andy and I would be happy to provide some training as well. So there are some resources that are surfacing if your firm doesn't have one.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure.
And just sort of on the last topic, we have some people asking about just autistic leaders and having autistic leaders really involved in the Autism at Work movement, and particularly in the Autism at Work Roundtable. Are there opportunities for people who are autistic to get involved and become representatives within this program and process and within the Roundtable?
Yeah. So I believe the roundtable is around employers, and I'm not sure of the details of how to be involved with it as an individual, but I think reaching out to them to see how that might take place is something that I'm not familiar with, but I would encourage you to send an email in that way.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And how about non-technical programs? Are there non-technical Autism at Work programs?
Yes. So even some of the firms that we mentioned, for example, SAP has their Autism at Work program employs across the last time I counted was 29 roles. And some of them are IT, some of them are not IT. So they employ in HR, they employ in marketing, they employ across a variety of roles. And we see that across different companies. I think JP Morgan Chase, if I remember the numbers, they're also available on the Autism at Work playbook. Not all of the companies and the firms I talked about are specific to IT. And if you look at the Autism at Work Employer Roundtable, you see a variety of companies, not just technology. If you look at my page, there are service industries, there's tactile, there's all kinds of firms and roles that are emerging. And we're seeing a broader number of companies coming into play. The initial focus of my work was IT, but there are other firms outside of IT.
Thank you. Yeah, we've gotten, there are a number of questions about different non-technical roles. And I think we're wrapping up our time here, but the last question about non-technical roles is really, we've had a number of people talk about HR roles and recruitment. So human resources seems to be an area that people are interested in having autism at work programs. Is there anything that you're doing within that domain?
Not me individually, but I know some of these firms are hiring within these broad roles for sure.
Okay.
Great.
Well, thank you so much for your participation and for answering questions. There's clearly quite a bit of interest in what you're doing. So this was really a wonderful discussion. So thank you. And I'll turn it over to
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Hala, for the brilliant presentation and the wonderful work that you have done. There's really much that we still need to do, but you have laid out a really good framework for people to follow. So that's really going to be helping the field a lot. Thank you. So we are going to